Good day to all. This is Christine Singer from Sustainable Energy for All, and I am very pleased to be moderating this session today on Energizing Finance 2019. This is a continuing research series produced by SEforALL in partnership with the Climate Policy Initiative, as well as Catalyst Off-Grid Advisors and E3 Analytics. And it is an in-depth research and analysis of the supply and demand of finance. Finance that's needed to achieve SDG 7, universal access to modern cooking solutions and electricity for all. We've had a projection out there for a number of years on the volume of capital that's needed. The biblical reference to $51 billion of capital needed annually to achieve universal energy access, and $4.4 billion a year to achieve universal access to clean cooking solutions. Energizing Finance is a unique body of work that actually looks at where we are in meeting those annual projections. This year, the Understanding the Landscape 2019 report looks at the actual international public and private finance commitments that are happening to achieve electricity access. And this year, because this is the third year we're doing this report, we actually have the opportunity for a 5-year trends presentation. But looking at the commitments, and Olivia Caldray, the lead finance specialist for Sustainable Energy for All, will go into detail on some of these findings. But looking at the commitments is just one side of the of providing finance for SDG 7. The other side is actually the demand side. And this year, taking the pulse, it's the second year that we're going to be doing this, the first being in 2017. This year, we're looking at 3 countries, and with Catalyst Off-Grid Advisors and E3 Analytics, actually looking at what is the demand by enterprises in the energy access space, both electricity and cooking, for debt, equity, and grant funds that would enable them to actually deliver the very clean solutions we're talking about. So that's going to give us a perception on the blend and volume of capital needed at a country level. But this year, we've also added a very important type of capital in that analysis, which is affordability gap. With the desire to leave no one behind, we're looking at 3 countries and saying, what will it actually take for the enterprises to deliver and for the households and consumers to afford it? I strongly encourage you to dig into these reports. What Olivia and colleagues from CPI and Catalyst are going to share is just the top of what this report series actually can deliver to you in terms of data and evidence. And the purpose is to inform and influence decision makers. It's quite clear from the Tracking SDG 7 Progress Report that we are way off base in terms of meeting our SDG 7 goals. And this Energizing Finance series provides information that should inform those that are providing the capital, where it is needed most, what kinds of instruments, geographies, levels of finance, and what's being needed at the country level in terms of finance and policy actions. So with that, just a couple of housekeeping items. You'll see a question and answer chat box. Please put your questions into there, and we'll do our best to cover those during the course of this hour. We will have an opportunity to receive questions after this, and we're going to be asking you to send future questions as you read through the reports to energizingfinance@seforall.com. And we'll try to tackle as many of these questions as we can. It's also important to know that we're going to be videotaping and recording this webinar, and it'll be shared on the web. So if you're unable to stay throughout the course of the whole webinar, or have other colleagues who you think would like to have this higher level overview of the report, please do send them to the website and the recorded webinar. With that, I just want to introduce who the other speakers are you'll be hearing from today. I mentioned Olivia Caldray, who's the lead finance specialist at SEforALL and the lead project manager for this report series. Angela Falcone from Climate Policy Initiative, and Dan Murphy from Catalyst Off-Grid Advisors. And with that, Olivia, I'd like to turn over to you and begin the introduction of this very, very deep, detailed report series.
Thanks very much, Christine. Hello, everyone. It's Olivia Coldry speaking. Thank you very much, Christine, for your introduction, and delighted to have everyone with us today. I hope you'll find the presentation and the Q&A interesting for your work and very relevant. I think you will. Also delighted to be joined by colleagues from CPI, Angela Falconer, Caroline Dreyer and Valerie Furio, as well as Dan Murphy and Ian Muir from Catalyst Off-Grid Advisors. So very warm welcome. As Christine mentions, we have a lot of material to get through, so I'm going to dive right in so that we leave plenty of time for Q&A towards the end. So the two reports this year, as Christine's mentioned, Understanding the Landscape and Taking the Pulse, very complementary. Understanding the Landscape is a 5-year trend analysis of finance commitments for electrification and clean cooking in 20 high-impact countries. So these are 20 countries globally, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, with the largest energy access deficits, and they represent about 80% of the global population without access. There are selected country case studies in this year's edition of Understanding the Landscape: Nepal and Nigeria for clean cooking, and the Philippines and Uganda for electrification. So if your work focuses on those countries in particular, I very much commend the report to you. Equally, Taking the Pulse is focused on particular countries, in that case Madagascar, the Philippines and Uganda. We've quite deliberately focused on Uganda and the Philippines this year, and I'll come to that in the presentation. And it's strong modelling to forecast SDG 7 finance needs out to 2030, as Christine mentions, supported by deep dive qualitative analysis to underpin and validate the model. So let's get started from there. Note on Understanding the Landscape's methodology. Finance commitments for two key aspects of energy access: electricity and clean cooking. Finance for electricity, the team at CPI has tracked finance commitments supporting all grid-connected plants, the transmission and distribution infrastructure that supports them, as well as mini-grid and off-grid solutions. So in Understanding the Landscape methodology, we term mini-grid and off-grid solutions is an umbrella term. That is further divided into finance for residential energy access or electricity access, and finance for other uses, most notably industrial and commercial use. Those familiar with the World Bank's multi-tier framework will recognise energy access tiers. Finance is allocated for energy uses that flow through to energy access tiers 1 to 5. So tier 1 being basic service, enough to power appliances and so on, through to full access at tier 5. Similar story for clean cooking. Finance commitments are tracked to support clean fuels and technologies for cooking, for example, biogas and LPG. They are divided into residential and non-residential uses. As we might expect, most finance commitments that we track for clean cooking are for the residential sector. So just some headline key messages on electrification before I've dived into the detail. We're clearly at a tipping point internationally with 1 year to go until 2020 and 11 till 2030 to reach universal access. The data is telling us consistently that that is increasingly unlikely without substantial action. So the bigger we leave a financing hole for energy access, the more difficult it is to fill, and the quicker it needs to be filled. That's where we are now. We've seen this year that finance for electrification is increasing, but quite slowly. So there's been a positive trend in absolute terms, $36 billion overall in finance tracked to our high-impact countries in 2017 versus $30 billion on average annually over 2015-2016. So an improvement, but not a huge one. However, only about a third of that is flowing to residential customers. So that's, again, an improvement on previous reporting periods, but still only a quarter of the projected finance requirement that Christine mentioned earlier, the $51 billion a year. We're seeing a continued chronic underinvestment in sub-Saharan Africa. So in medical terms, we might describe the situation as chronic. In 2017, which is the year that data was most recently available for tracking purposes, 4 of 13 sub-Saharan African countries that make up our 20 high-impact countries reported an absolute decline in electrification finance, and 10 of those 13 countries each received less than $300 million. So if we put that against a $36 billion figure, that's no movement at all. In the worst case scenario, backwards or only marginal improvement in the hundreds of millions of dollars as opposed to billions. So that is putting the continent's status as really an economic powerhouse potentially on hold, and that is only being exacerbated by rapid population growth on the continent. Those interested in off-grid solutions, and familiar with last year's work, it is a very similar story, so a very marginal improvement compared to the last reporting period, but still only a little over 1.2% of total tracked finance commitments are going to off-grid solutions. So that's really not much at all. So this is an overview of our 20 high-impact countries organised regionally, East Asia and the Pacific on the left-hand side, right through to East Africa on the right. The red icons you see in the graphic here are the percentage of the population in each of those countries without electricity access, and the bars represent volume of capital commitments made to each country and a trend analysis against the previous reporting period. So interestingly, we can see the bulk of finance is going to South Asia, India and Bangladesh in particular. Nigeria in West Africa has been a bright spot in 2017, as well as to some extent the Philippines in the Asian region. On the other hand, most of West Africa, Central Africa and East Africa is seeing no movement at all, or at worst a decline in finance commitments. It's also interesting to point out in this slide, I think, that countries that are rapidly closing their electricity access gaps, notably India, Bangladesh and the Philippines, are seeing significant amounts of capital flowing to them. So we might draw some conclusions there about the policy settings in those countries and the environments that are more or less conducive to investment that have been created there, as opposed to some other parts of the world which are seeing less of an impact financially. Okay, so this is a sources table. So where is this money coming from? The majority over the past two reporting periods, so 2015 right through to 2017, are from corporates and project developers themselves. So there's a lot of balance sheet financing coming on. I'll come to that in the next slide. We're seeing continued investment from development finance institutions, both multilateral and bilateral. However, the big call out in 2017 is that those have been eclipsed by export credit agency finance, notably from India and China. So that's been a massive jump in finance commitments from that type of agency. So you'll be familiar with them as export-import banks, export promotion agencies, export credit agencies. That is the big change in 2017 to the extent that export credit agencies are now the #1 source of international public finance for electricity access in high-impact countries, more than the total of development finance institutions altogether. So that's interesting for those of us who have regular dialogue with development finance institutions. Are we not having that same conversation with export credit agencies? And in fact, do we need to be having that conversation with them? So for those interested in how the finance is flowing by instrument, you'll see a preponderance of debt in this chart, mostly project debt, but also a healthy amount of corporate debt. As I mentioned, balance sheet financing from project developers themselves. There is a relative lack of equity funding. That suggests to me that most of the funding is going to major projects on grid. So equity funding, particularly for companies that are delivering off-grid electricity solutions and to some extent mini-grid solutions, is not really flowing nowhere near to the same extent as debt finance. So suggesting that certainly companies that are sort of early on in their innovation cycle that need equity financing might not be finding it, particularly in the off-grid space. So taking a closer look at technology, so this is a share of finance for electricity access by technology type. So a good news story for those of us who advocate for sustainable energy. Grid-connected renewable energy makes up 61% of all finance tracked in 2017, and that's up considerably from the previous reporting period of 2015-2016. So a good news story for grid-connected renewables. As you'll see, there is still some grid-connected fossil fuel commitment being made. The big call out here, again, for those particularly interested in off-grid solutions, is we remain off track in terms of investment in that sector. So $430 million of a total $36 billion, that's about 1.2%. So not much change from the previous year, regrettably, and this is an increasing call out that we need to be addressing as an international community, particularly in recognition of the fact that off-grid solutions are going to reach the most vulnerable people, those at the last mile, those whom the central grid just won't reach. So a further breakdown of commitments by technology. So for people interested in renewables specifically, again, a significant increase since the previous reporting period. Great news. The majority is still driven by solar PV, so that continues to be the growth story in renewables. We've actually seen a pullback in commitments for wind energy projects in high impact countries. That's down about 13% over the previous period. There is a steep increase in large hydro, as you'll note in 2017. That's mostly attributable to one large plant in Nigeria, which was committed to the tune of just under $6 billion. So on the fossil fuel side, we're seeing that parts of the world still unable to kick fossil fuels for a variety of reasons that might not necessarily be a demand side issue. New finance commitments for coal-fired generation have actually decreased since the previous period, so that's great news. There were fewer plants committed to in terms of funding and a lower overall quantum of commitment. At SEforALL, we feel quite strongly about this issue. We see any new finance commitments of the coal-fired generation as uneconomic, quite frankly. They're not competitive in a growing number of markets with new renewable generation, and we're seeing economically that it's often cheaper to build a new large-scale solar or wind plant from scratch than to run a fully depreciated coal-fired power station. So that should be raising some serious questions for us as a community, particularly in light of the Paris Agreement commitments, particularly in light of the recent UN Secretary General's Climate Summit, and particularly the world's commitment to the SDGs as to why we're still doing this. A further point, 60% of all coal financing in 2017 was sourced from just two sources, India and China. So just to sort of point out how these numbers can really be skewed by some big projects, the two countries at the top of this chart are Bangladesh and India. 60% of all coal financing tracked was sourced from two export credit agencies, as I mentioned, India and China, for projects in Bangladesh. So that's where the green bar on the chart comes from. It's a lot of money from two sources going into a small number of projects. Similarly, in Nigeria, it's one big hydro plant. So you can see that they really skew the numbers. The other countries in the chart are receiving no money at all from export credit agencies, limited amounts of money from development finance, or no new commitments at all. So just switching gears for a moment and looking at finance for electricity commitments by end user, we can see that centralised generation, as I mentioned, is receiving the bulk of finance commitments, decentralised generation much less so. That's off-grid and mini-grid solutions. For decentralised finance commitments flowing to centralised solutions rather, most tiers of access that are being served are above residential. So most of that commitment is going to industrial and commercial use rather than residential use. For the first time, Understanding the Landscape tracks finance for energy access for the most vulnerable people, and we refer to those women at the last mile and displaced people. That's certainly going to be of interest for those on the call with a specific focus on this sector, these sectors. What we're seeing is improving energy access for women is going to require a concerted effort to overcome financing barriers that are often uniquely experienced by them. So that could be a lack of access to formal financial institutions by law, for example, in countries where women can't hold bank accounts in their own name, a lack of credit history or collateral, and often underscored by discriminatory social norms. So to really sort of move the needle on finance for women, we're going to require targeted financial solutions to address those specific unique barriers, supplemented by gender audits focused on metrics related to access finance that are critical to ensure equity. So this is an innovation in this year's report, and I'd certainly commend that chapter of the report to those of you who are working closely in this area. To underscore the point, this is an evolution of official development assistance with gender equality as an explicit policy objective. So in 2017, we saw from the OECD that just under $1 billion in ODA for the energy sector with gender equality was identified as an explicit policy objective. That's a significant increase since 2002. However, if we look at the trend analysis over time, over the past 10 years, while absolute flows have increased, the proportion has remained almost unchanged at 7%. So this is of total overseas development assistance going to the energy sector, it's only about 7% that's flowing to projects and programs with an explicit gender equality objective. So switching gears now again, I'm going to turn the conversation for the next few minutes to taking the pulse. This is a projection, as Christine mentioned at the outset, that we can compare with the historical analysis in understanding the landscape. There's some very interesting findings. What the team at Catalyst have done is create a quantitative model, which I'll ask Dan and Ian to speak to in a few minutes, to identify the volume and blend of finance required to achieve access to electrification and clean cooking in our 3 focus countries this year of Uganda, Madagascar and the Philippines. This in turn quantifies the size of the energy access challenge in those countries. So what we're seeing from the data is a really significant disconnect between the historical tracking data and the forecast. So just by way of example, in one of our focus countries, Madagascar, in 2017, CPI identified $29 million in actual finance commitments for off-grid solutions in Madagascar. The team at Catalyst has forecast that just under $120 million is going to be required annually to finance universal access by 2030 there through mini-grid and standalone solar solutions, and that doesn't account for any subsidy or affordability gap financing. So what I'll do over the next few minutes is just dive a little bit deeper into that. So taking the 3 focus countries, the team at Catalyst has taken as a starting point which proportions of the population the central grid will reach. So that's projected by 2030 to be about 87.5% of households in the Philippines, just under half of households in Uganda, and just under 14% in Madagascar. They've projected through the model, validated by qualitative data, the access deficit in each of those countries is going to require about $6.4 billion in total finance for the default or residual off-grid solutions in the form of mini-grids and off-grid and clean cooking to achieve SDG 7. So that's a $6.4 billion financing gap as modelled that needs to be filled through 2030. So let's take the Philippines as a bit of a case study example. So the Philippines has done well in closing its energy access gap. It's now over 90% of the population that has access. That's a good story. That has mostly come through grid-connected plants. So we can see from the historical data and understanding the landscape that grid-connected fossil fuel plants have supplied the bulk of the Philippines with electricity over the years. That has been supplemented by grid-connected renewables to a lesser extent. So a good story. Historical access rates in the Philippines, to reflect the last slide, mostly provided by the grid. The Philippines has actually done quite well in prioritising access via mini-grids as well. So mini-grids currently deliver electricity to approximately 800,000 households. That makes sense in an archipelagic state of over 7,500 islands. Mini-grids are going to have to be part of the solution. What the team has done at Catalyst is forecast out to 2030 the proportions of each solution that are going to be met. So grid access still playing an important role, mini-grids playing an important role, but standalone solar equally playing an increasingly important role. That makes sense if we think about people who are going to be best served by standalone solutions, mostly those living in the remote islands. So that's about 2.5 million households rather, connections over the period 2020 to 2030, and it will require a significant amount of finance. So that's a number. What that means in practice is we're going to have some very innovative entrepreneurs and innovative business models to help reach those customers sustainably. Even then, it's most likely that people in the most remote regions are also going to be the people least able to afford electricity access. So we see a role for subsidy or affordability gap financing, as we call it, play in the Philippines. Thanks, Eyal. So just to break down the financial cost of closing the access gap versus standalone solar, that's projected to be $864 million up to 2030. with an additional amount of $33 million in subsidy or affordability gap financing to meet the requirement. Breaking that down further, we recognise that enterprises require different financial solutions at different stages of their development. So that's broken down, that $864 million figure is broken down into debt, equity and grant funding to reflect different stages of the financial innovation cycle and business maturity. Extrapolating that to mini-grid enterprises as well, you can see the figures there. I won't go through them in detail, but that's the financing gap as projected by taking the pulse to get to universal access to electricity in the Philippines by 2030. We'll come back to that in the Q&A and when I invite Catalyst to say a few words. For the moment, we'll spend a couple of minutes on clean cooking. So Finance for Clean Cooking Access, it's a different set of 20 countries in clean cooking. Here they are, again, organised by region, and again demonstrating through the red icons the percentage of the population in each country without access. So in large parts of East Africa in particular, that's over 90% of the population. So this is a huge problem that needs filling. We can see a couple of standout countries in terms of receipt of commitments, financial commitments for clean cooking in 2017, Kenya being first and foremost among them, as well as a number of other East African countries. Otherwise, the story is pretty grim. There hasn't been a lot of movement. In many cases, no finance flowing at all for clean cooking solutions in 2017. So where is that coming from? It's $32 million in finance in 2017 that's been identified. That's really a drop in the ocean compared to what's actually needed. That is actually a major decline from the previous reporting period, 73% in fact, and less than 1% of the estimated finance required for universal access to clean cooking solutions by 2030. So it's orders of magnitude off what it needs to be. In terms of a breakdown, there is money coming from international public sources that has regrettably declined. We are seeing in a bright spot an increasing amount of money coming from international private sources for this work, which I'll come into in more detail in a moment. Not very much, if any, domestic public finance flowing. So it's a pretty grim story, and we've seen a pullback in international public finance. So who's providing the private finance? An interesting range of early stage investors, so venture capital, philanthropy is playing a key role in moving the sector, and the other early stage investors that you might see in a nascent sector, for example, angels and entrepreneurs own capital. So that's a small bright spot, an increasing amount of private finance, but nowhere near enough, and recognising the sector's nascence. So for those interested in technologies for clean cooking, most money over the past couple of reporting periods has gone to improve biomass stoves through programs and otherwise. In 2017, we saw a slight uptick in finance commitments for alcohol solutions, so stoves and fuels, and biogas digesters really round out the bulk of the finance commitments for clean cooking. So just a last couple of slides to illustrate the lumpiness and the lack of strategy in the sector as we see it. Taking Nigeria as an example, in 2013-2014 we saw a relatively large amount of money going to Nigeria from international public sources, almost none from the private sector. That fell off a cliff in 2015, 2016, and even further in 2017. So you can see that even in the space of 5 years, there has been a massive change in finance flows to Nigeria for clean cooking solutions and projects. The following slide shows you where that money has gone to over the same period. In 2013, 2014, it was LPG stoves. The following year, alcohol-based solutions, and now improved biomass stoves. So there's really not a lot of rhyme or reason to this, or a lot of strategy that we can see behind it. And that's a big call out for us for the clean cooking sector is really the lack of strategy and coordination in projects and programs. So just to wrap up with some headline key messages from SEforALL's side on cooking, we really need to wake up to this issue as a global community. I know some of you on the call are working hard at this, but as an international community, we are failing to tackle the access challenge for clean cooking, both financially and strategically. It's estimated that over $4 billion a year is required through 2030 to close access gaps, and we saw in 2017 $32 million in finance flowing. So that's orders of magnitude off what it needs to be. This is obviously a major environmental issue, a major public health issue. It affects about 3 billion people globally, and that number is continuing to increase as the population grows. We've seen a large decline in international public finance, which is regrettable. We recognise the need for catalytic capital in this sector. It's nascent, it's growing, it needs support, and that for the most part means grants and concessional funding to really help develop the market and kick-start it. So that's what's missing to a significant extent. We believe that meeting SDG 7 targets for cooking is going to require a paradigm shift in strategy. So we need to take a refreshed and holistic approach to the issue that creates big markets rather than focuses on incremental solutions. And finally, really a call out for data. So no good decisions either by policy makers, donors, program designers, funders can be made without data. We need a much better approach to capturing data for the sector and sharing it. So I'll leave it there just with an acknowledgement to our funders and supporters. I know some of you are on the call as well. This work wouldn't be possible without you, so many, many thanks from us. And we trust you found good value in your investment. We've certainly enjoyed making the contribution to the global discourse. So I'll stop there and hand back to our moderator, Christine.
Thank you so much, Olivia. There's so much detail and data in this report that you've really brought the highlights to life. And again, I encourage folks to dig into these reports as your time allows to fill out further some of what Olivia just handled at a very high level. I'd like to, before we actually get into the questions and answers, I'd like to ask our colleagues from CPI and Catalyst to just share a few words about the report, about the experience and how they actually developed what they see as the overall values. And then we'll get into the actual questions and answers. So please do use the Q&A chat box and send us along those things that you'd like us to try to address in the next half hour. So Angela, if I could turn to you, please, and talk a little bit about how you see this work with SEforALL and this understanding the landscape.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Christine. And thank you so much to Olivia for the great presentation of the findings from this work. There is a lot of detail in there, a lot of time spent gathering this data and putting it all together. It's also not easy. The data challenges are tough, and I'm sure we might get back to that. But we've been working with SEforALL gladly over the last 3 years now on this work, which we think is crucial for tracking progress and highlighting remaining gaps in this sector. Really, the clear main trend for us is really seeing that we're falling still far short of what is required for universal energy access. That is also in alignment with the Paris Agreement. We can really see that there's a need for an order of magnitude change in the investments in electricity supply that support the people in most needs around the world. So connecting the most vulnerable remote populations, and especially, as Olivia pointed out, in sub-Saharan Africa, where we've still got huge percentages of the residential populations without access to electricity. And, you know, furthermore, the continued financing of new non-renewable power is incompatible with both the energy access goals and, of course, the Paris Agreement objectives. And then when it comes to clean cooking, it seems to us that it's not just a gear change that we need, but really a radical rethink or a new big market solution to scale up from the really small amounts that are being invested at the moment. And what we would see is, when we look at on the sort of needs side and the investment needs, that it's not huge amounts of capital relatively that we're looking for here. Capital is available, of course, in the financial system. So the question is, how do we get allocated to these objectives and mobilized? On the landscape of finance this year, the report includes many examples of promising financial mechanisms and business models that are being developed and implemented in distributed energy, renewable energy, and the clean cooking space. which we think holds a lot of promise to be scaled up. So these include, for example, guarantees, results-based mechanisms, pay per service models for cooking, as well as electrification, securitization to free up capital that can be reinvested by developers, and some maybe less innovative and more established approaches which are still needed more of, such as crowdfunding or project preparation facilities. So the real question then is, how do we scale these up, and really at the scale, the speed that we need as well to fill the investment gap urgently, as well as those sort of approaches to increasing finance in terms of institutions, government institutions, and financial institutions. How can we align what those institutions are doing with the objectives and ambitions to transform energy systems and meet the Paris Agreement? So we're really looking forward to continuing the discussion with SEforALL and all of you on the line today, to think about how we can collectively drive forward that alignment of portfolios and development of mechanisms to fill some of these still huge gaps. And with that, I'll pass back to Christine.
Thank you very much, Angela, for that insights into this. Dan Murphy, if I could turn to you, please, for some overview comments on the Taking the Pulse report.
Great, thanks very much, Christine. And first I want to give a broader thanks to Olivia and Christine and the rest of the SEforALL team for a really great collaboration during this assignment. And what I'd first like to do is speak a little bit more about the methodology that we employed in this iteration of Taking the Pulse, and then talk for a couple of minutes about some of the most striking takeaways that we saw from each of the focus countries, which was mentioned earlier, are Uganda, the Philippines, and Madagascar in the case of Taking the Pulse. So with respect to the methodology, we took a very robust empirical approach to the assignment. That is to say that we used existing data sets and information that we know about each of the three focus countries to really tell the story of electrification, both retrospectively in terms of what's happened to date, and then to forecast forward what we thought the most likely scenario would need to be in order to achieve universal electrification by 2030. And then what we did was to basically model out the financing needs that underpinned that likely forecast scenario. And given our very solid, nuanced understanding of the business models that underpin off-grid solutions, whether that is standalone solar solutions for households or mini-grid enterprises, we were able to establish not just the total quantum of capital that would be required to deliver each of those technologies in a given market at a certain scale, but also the blend of capital that would be required. We know that these enterprises are heavily dependent on philanthropic capital, on patient capital in their earliest stages to prove out their business models, thus necessitating pretty significant volumes of grant financing. Of course, they also need to raise equity capital as well to scale the business, and then leverage both those grants and equity resources to crowd in the debt financing that is quite often the most efficient way to build out these and deploy these assets within a given market. And I should also say that, in addition to modeling this out for electrification, we also undertook the same exercise with respect to clean cooking. And to the best of our knowledge, this was an unprecedented exercise that we endeavored to do on cooking. And again, we really leveraged the power of existing data to understand the current situation at the household level in terms of the ways in which households are cooking, and forecast forward a cleaner path through to 2030. And the last point with respect to methodology is that I wanted to share that we also undertook interviews in each of the three markets to really get the story behind the numbers that the empirical model was telling us. And I think that's always very important to hear direct from stakeholders, and particularly directly from entrepreneurs, to understand the challenges and realities that they face on the ground. One final point on methodology was that we did model out the affordability gap in each of the markets. So this was, it enables us to understand the shortfall in household ability to pay for modern energy services, whether that was a certain level of electrification services through standalone solutions or mini grids, or a certain type of technology in terms of improved cook stoves on the cooking side. So just very quickly, in terms of some key takeaways for us, I won't speak to the Philippines. I think that Olivia did a very nice job summarizing the key insights there, but I would really encourage the audience to read that chapter and read the much more nuanced story that is told in the report itself. I think first in Uganda, what's really striking there is that Uganda is an off-grid solar success story to date. And the modeling in the report shows that about 19% of Ugandan households are connected to the electricity grid. And a similar percentage, approximately 19% of households, are actually using off-grid solar solutions for their electrification needs, which is really quite striking. And when we forecast that forward, off-grid solar will actually need to be even more prominent and deliver electricity services to 52% of households. And that alone is going to require approximately $1.4 billion of financing. And on the affordability side, that's going to necessitate over $300 million of financing to cover the affordability gap. With respect to Madagascar, again, a real study in contrast there, particularly with respect to the power utility that has really struggled in the face of the political crisis in Madagascar, and has faced significant hardship both financially and operationally, and to the point where the utility is not able to even keep up with the pace of population growth in the country in terms of the new connections that it's delivering to households. And so what that means is that off-grid and mini-grid solutions are going to need to be very, very prevalent in the market in order to achieve universal access. And I think most striking, Madagascar faces a huge affordability gap challenge, very, very low ability to pay there. And so the model showed that they would need over $600 million in affordability gap financing for electrification, and over $200 million for clean cooking. So a very challenging context, but I think what's encouraging is that we actually have some robust figures in terms of the total quantum and blend that's going to be required in each of these markets. And most importantly, we need to make sure that we have the enterprises and entrepreneurs to deliver on those electrification and cooking solutions going forward. So let me stop there, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan, for providing that additional insight and color to the reports. We've had a number of questions come in both over the Q&A chat as well as the normal chat. I encourage you, please use the Q&A. It just helps us kind of organize it a little bit better, the Q&A chat box. What I'd like to do, some of them, we're going to go in the order within which we received them. And some of them are kind of a very short answer, and some of them are a little bit longer. So please bear with us if your question is just a very short answer. It's not that we don't consider it important. It's just a short, direct answer. So with that, I'd like to start with the first question, which is, and this is going to be directed to our Angela from CPI, as it relates more to, I think, the understanding the landscape type of analysis. And the question is that we as NGOs are engaged in universal energy access. Why do we not have finance to begin awareness raising, technology transfer, education training for behavior change? 2030 is tomorrow. So Angela, could you address please how the report deals with understanding where finance is going for these types of activities?
Yeah, sure. So we have found, I mean, these types of activities we would sort of term as market support around technology transfer, capacity building, awareness raising, education, behavioural change, etc. And what we've found is that only 1% of support, of investment is going towards that within the overall landscape. And this is actually quite a decrease, which is probably what a lot of you are experiencing on the ground as well, between what we saw in our last year's report for 2015-16, which was 870, down to 350 million in this latest report. And a sort of similar picture on the grants that usually fund such activities from DFIs, development finance institutions, and donors. The funding has been pretty stagnant. So we don't really know what the reasons are for this, you know, going back upstream to what's driven these sort of decreases or stagnations. It could also be that in 2015-16 we saw a particular peak there in some programs that received commitments, but certainly, yeah, that's also what we're seeing, that in the most recent years there has been this unfortunate decrease.
Thank you, Angela. And the next one, Angela, is also from with an understanding the landscape perspective, and whether the data on coal investment takes account of recent cancellations of coal power plant orders in India.
So in short, yes, it does. So there were no new investments for coal plants identified for India in 2017 because of those of coal-fired thermal power plants in India becoming financially stressed. But what we have seen is, I guess, offshoring of the activity of India and China in terms of the investments that Olivia mentioned from the export-import banks of China, which jointly finance coal projects in Bangladesh in particular, as did the China Export-Import Bank. And also in Africa as well.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to just add one clarification to that. Is it's important to recall and realize that understanding the landscape is tracking commitments. It's not tracking disbursements. So it's really looking at what is the intent of the finance in the space of energy access. And so while in years past, we would have captured the commitments to those coal plants, there's not actually a cancellation, if you will, or a deduction of those commitments if they're not dispersed. Just a commercial for a report that will be coming out next year, which is one of my favorites. It's called Missing the Mark, which is where we're actually looking at the disbursements and looking at disbursements vis-a-vis commitments. This will be a repeat of a report that was also undertaken in 2017. And that's where we'll really get to see how much of those commitments to coal or commitments to decentralized renewables are actually making their way into the market and potentially delivering impact. So keep moving along on our questions. Olivia, I'm going to turn to you for this one. And this is from a colleague, Hassan Idris, and it's achieving SDG 7 in the face of catastrophic global climatic events is becoming an uphill task. Which financial resources can developing countries tap while tackling electricity access issues? And do you see financing from international private resources increasing proportionally as we see more and more global climatic events?
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Hassan, for the question. It's a very good one and obviously increasingly relevant and topical. And I think the answer is difficult and nuanced. So on the one hand, we have the international community having subscribed and committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, not least number 7, which is important for achievement of many of, if not all of the other goals. So on the one hand, we have an international commitment to achieving the SDGs, including universal access to energy. On the other, we have this finance hole. In the circumstances that you speak to, and that's sort of catastrophic events, we see a continuing and important role for public finance. So those very same governments that have committed to the SDGs are also funding the institutions that have typically helped reconstruction efforts and that have broad mandates to assist with developing energy markets worldwide. They're mostly the development banks, as many on this call will know. So there is a commitment on both sides there to a set of goals that we want to reach as a globe by 2030, and the institutions, the financial institutions that will help us do that, which to a large extent, in public terms, are the development finance institutions. So in direct response to your question, they are the financial resources that developing countries can and should be tapping. What we're seeing from the data, though, is that they're not necessarily pulling their weight in the SDG 7 effort. We would like to see development finance really step up, even if that requires another refreshed look at their mandates to keep up with what is ultimately a very dynamic global energy sector. So the energy sector is moving, technology is moving for energy technology deployment. The financial institutions, particularly public finance, isn't necessarily moving with that. So we're advocating really for a hard look at the public international finance community to address that gap. I would hope that when that catalytic capital comes into the market, that will enable more private sector investment, as you also query. So typically public finance has acted as a catalyst through concessional terms in its financing. I would hope that would be the case. The other issue that catastrophic events raise from a financing perspective is obviously insurance and the ability of the global insurance industry to insure risk in the face of increasingly volatile and frequent climate events. So unfortunately, I don't have a straight answer to your question, but I would hope that public finance can play an important role as it's designed to do, and I would hope that private finance follows.
Great, Olivia, I'm going to stay with you for the next question, which is in regards to seeing more balance sheet financing, and the comment being that DFIs have stopped or slowed down financing, and mini-grid developers in particular need to source their own funds to complete projects. It's not sustainable or scalable. And I think some of your previous comments address that, but is there anything further you'd want to add on the role of development finance institutions?
Thanks, Christine, and thanks for the question. I think it's a good one. As you say, it underscores precisely my last point, which is that the mini-grid sector is growing internationally. As we've seen from the Taking the Pulse projections, it's going to be playing an important role in meeting universal access targets by 2030. To the extent that the private financial institutions aren't in that sector yet, we'd like to see public finance play an important role, particularly in de-risking, where there are actual perceived risks in mini-grid development, and the questioner will know all about those being in the sector. And it's quite natural that balance sheet financing is going to play a role, or is playing a role, in the absence of public or private commercial finance. So yes, is the short comment to balance sheet financing for mini-grids. That's a particular focus of our work at SEforALL. In the next months, we will be releasing a report on the global state of the market for mini-grids as an attempt to increase the amount of data for the sector to help with decision making. Again, it's a matter of collective effort, not reinventing the wheel with every new mini-grid transaction. What can we learn from each other? What can each project learn and share with the community, so that the mini-grid sector as a whole benefits, not least in terms of financing and streamlining finance for the sector through streamlined transaction documentation, streamlined processes, and so on.
Thanks, Olivia. Dan, I'm going to come to you with 2 questions, please. One is if you could just give an understanding as to how the 3 countries were selected for the Taking the Pulse analysis. And then to Charlie Miller's question, just a little bit more insight into the affordability gap and how that stream of financing aligns with the debt, equity, and grant financing for enterprises. You touched on that a little bit in the methodology, but if you could just share a little bit more, because that is a new addition to this year's Taking the Pulse, and one that is really beginning to get more discussion amongst the industry and governments about the affordability of off-grid solutions.
Sure, thanks, Christine. So in terms of the choice of the 3 countries for this edition of Taking the Pulse, the 3 were derived from the list of the 20 high impact countries that have been established that underpin the Energizing Finance series as a whole. And so the exercise was first to basically identify the countries that had already been covered in the previous report and exclude those. Then we wanted to identify countries that appeared both on the electrification and cooking lists, the high impact country lists. And from there, we wanted to make sure that we had nice geographic diversity. So of course, representation in sub-Saharan Africa, and even diversity within that in terms of Francophone and Anglophone. And then the Southeast Asia story with the Philippines. And, finally, we really wanted to have a cohort of countries that really told quite diverse access stories, which I think the 3 countries do. And to your second question about the affordability gap, basically, what we did in the report, and we've done this in previous assignments that we've deployed this methodology, and it leverages a tool that the World Bank has developed that is called PovCalNet. And the PovCalNet tool actually establishes the ability to pay within a given country using existing household survey data, and actually plots it out quite nicely if you base it on a certain particular metric. And so what we did was to basically map out, and you'll see in the report, we'll map out a presumed price that a household would need to pay either for a solar lantern, if they were to purchase a solar lantern in installments on a monthly basis. I think the model projected that to be somewhere in the range of about $3 per month. And then we also modeled out what it would look like to purchase an entry-level multi-light solar home system, somewhere in the range of about $7 per month. And then we used the PovCalNet tool to basically filter and model out what a household's consumption looks like on a monthly basis if they were to spend 5% of their consumption on electrification. And that then shows us what percentage of households would be able to afford that solar lantern at $3 a month, and what percentage of households would be able to afford that multi-light point system. And obviously the gap that results gives us what we think is a reasonably robust back of the envelope sense of the percentage of households that would need some sort of additional support to be able to afford those electrification services.
Great, thank you, Dan. And some of you may have seen, we're going to go a little bit past the hour here and tackle 1 or 2 more questions. Please stay with us if you can, and we will do a response to these questions as well if we didn't get to your particular ask. A number of the questions that I've seen come in relate to the affordability gap, relate to some of the numbers that Dan kind of covered rather quickly, given time. I encourage you, please go to the reports. The data in there is quite deep. The presentation of it is quite clear, we think, and I believe you'll have an understanding to some of those methodological questions or specific data questions that you're asking, and the report should provide those answers. A number of questions have come in related to Nigeria, LPG, and clean cooking. And for that, I'd like to turn to Angela from CPI to give us, which actually looked at 2 case studies in regards to cooking, one in Nigeria and one in Nepal, which wasn't presented today. But Angela, if you could please just give us a bit of, a little bit deeper insight into what the findings were about Nigeria and the use of LPG for cooking.
Yeah, sure. And I'd encourage the folks who have asked questions on this to take a look at the case study in the report, because it is quite a complicated picture, and we'd also appreciate feedback from you on whether it reflects the reality of all of the sort of problems and potential challenges or opportunities. But I guess to characterize some of the main points, there seems to be inertia on the use of kerosene, leading from subsidies that were present for kerosene purchase up to 2016. And of course, in rural areas, solid biomass is free, so willingness to pay for cleaner alternatives is one of the challenges. But of course, many of you will know that Nigeria is one of the largest producers of LPG on the continent, and it could become a major clean cooking solution for the country. So the question is, how to make that big transition, a lot around behavioural change, but also a lot around regulation, enforcement, and actually safety as well. So it's a pretty complicated picture where we need to see where there could be new business models that can overcome some of the inertia that I mentioned, and also get over, sort of some of the small challenges that we'd face in the transition to that new fuel, around even issues like VAT for domestic LPG, and how the fuel could be sort of circulated around the country. Some large scale investment in infrastructure for distribution would be required as well, and to ensure safety for refilling. But definitely there's a huge commercial opportunity there as well, to be had if the right collaborations between government and private sector can be formed.
Thank you, Angela, for addressing that. And again, refer to the chapter. I'm going to provide a few concluding comments, and then we're going to wrap up. I do want to encourage you, the email address for additional questions is shown there on the slide. And please do know we will respond to your questions and get these answers back out. We very much appreciate the feedback. It helps us in fine-tuning the report, which will be repeated next year. Understanding the Landscape 2020 will be a publication of SEforALL's next year. We'll continue with the trends analysis. Just in concluding comments, one is there were a number of comments around the clean cooking, number of comments around, if you will, local grassroots organizations and women's groups desiring more access to information, more access to finance, for clean cooking solutions. And I think one of the most important takeaways from this report, both in terms of understanding the landscape and the demonstration of the de minimis and just travesty level of funding that's going into clean cooking, which is embarrassing for the global community. We need more advocacy. We need these issues to be percolating up into policymakers, into decision makers at national and local levels, and certainly within the global community. Olivia will be presenting the Energizing Finance 2019 results on clean cooking at the Clean Cooking Alliance's Investment Forum next week. So those of you who may be in Nairobi, I encourage you to attend the session on finance and to really think about how do we advocate for more engagement in the clean cooking sector. It's affecting 3 billion people. In regards to big markets, the issue on big markets is acknowledging that in order for the clean cooking to really move the needle, we need to be looking at this differently. We need to be looking at this more holistically. And just like we talk about integrated electrification planning, there's the opportunity to really look at integrated clean cooking solution planning. And that's a bit of what you'll get when you dig into taking the pulse, really looking at moving from improved cook stoves to clean fuels. How do we look at it whole and actually focus on accelerating access to clean fuels, because that's where the big dollars and the big investments from the private sector will likely be achieved. In closing, I want to thank Olivia, Angela, and Dan for their contributions, both today as well as the leadership they've shown in bringing these reports together. In addition to the Clean Cooking Alliance Forum next week, the results of Energizing Finance will be presented over a series of venues and meetings over the next 6 to 9 months. We want this information and data to inform and influence future decisions. It's clear that the trajectory that we're on for finance has to change if we have any attempt to meet the SDG 7 goals. That's same for electricity in terms of household access, and as I've just said, very much on the clean cooking front. Next year, pay attention, 2020 will be coming out. We appreciate your feedback. What's good about these reports for you in your own advocacy and fundraising? Let's work on that to strengthen these reports, adding things like displaced persons and gender this year, the affordability gap. We're trying to really bring out those areas that give you more ammunition to achieve the energy access goals. Understanding the Landscape 2020, Missing the Mark 2020, a year from now, we'll look forward to seeing you back here on a webinar then. Thank you so much and a great day to all.